Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, colleagues, attendees. It's a pleasure to be with you today to kick off the Global Dialogue on Biodiversity, Law and Governance second day with a panel discussion on exploring the role of the BBNJ agreement in bolstering ocean resilience to climate change and achieving 30 by 30 ambition. Before we start, let us all together acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we stand and across the globe and pay our respects to the elders past, present, and emerging. I wanted to start off with a few introductory remarks to frame our discussion today. As we heard yesterday, many references to very important reports addressing the state of the ocean, including the IPCC report on oceans and the cryosphere and the IPBES report in its global assessment, both of which concluded that the anthropogenic climate change is one of the main stressors on the ocean resilience and marine biodiversity. Climate change has its own framework convention under which global efforts are coordinated to address climate action, whether mitigation or adaptation. But I think it's very important that we acknowledge that there are other international legal agreements that specifically address biodiversity. And these are of paramount importance when we're addressing this very major stress on the ocean environment. So we will focus on the High Seas Treaty currently being negotiated and examine practical considerations for interlinkages between that treaty and current considerations for elaborating a post-2020 biodiversity framework that aims to bolster ocean resilience, including through a 30 by 30 target. At the outset, I think it is very important to acknowledge that the High Seas Treaty and the post-2020 biodiversity framework negotiations are quite distinct processes and are being conducted under two different legal agreements. So while the processes are multilateral in nature and involve largely the same countries, representatives engaged in the two processes may not be the same. Negotiating groups as well, such as the Group of 77 in China or the Alliance of Small Island Developing States, which are very commonly referred to in some negotiations and others, have different roles and potentially no role in one or the other process, which makes for very different dynamics and influences in the processes. That the negotiations are being conducted under two separate legal agreements with different outputs expected also is a very significant point, because it means the stakes from both the procedural and substantive perspectives are quite different. The post-2020 biodiversity framework is being negotiated under the Convention on Biological Diversity and International Environmental Agreement, and it will result in a set of global goals that are expected to be incorporated into national plans, largely on a voluntary basis. On the other hand, the negotiations for the High Seas Treaty is a multilateral treaty negotiation under the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, which we always call UNCLOS. Well, UNCLOS is known as the Constitution of the World's Ocean and Seas and provides a legal order for all aspects of ocean space. It establishes rights and duties of states in this regard, including with respect to delimitation, environmental control, marine scientific research, economic and commercial activities in areas within national jurisdiction and beyond. The new High Seas Treaty will elaborate and operationalize provisions of UNCLOS and create legally binding obligations for those countries who sign on to it. So I think this is a very different context with very different results. So these are important, but at the same time, they do not preempt the potential for these processes to build on each other and to facilitate their common and central objective, which is the conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity. Moreover, I think this is really important to highlight. There's a much wider context within which these processes are occurring that drives an incentive or need to foster closer interlinkages between the two. And I won't even mention the whole COVID-19 pandemic, but I think that is also relevant. It was raised yesterday in several of the discussions, which I think was really insightful. Humanity is facing a multi-frontal crisis in nature: climate, ocean, and biodiversity, with very uneven impacts and a disproportionate burden falling upon the most vulnerable. So that context alone underpins a political and scientific imperative that urgent action is needed and integrated and inclusive approaches are essential as a means to optimize benefits for planet and people. As the panel hopes to illuminate, these two processes stand to dramatically impact the health of our global planet. We will use as a point of reference or point of departure the target of achieving 30 by 30. And we will take a deep dive into the why. So we'll have our scientific perspectives from Professor Kellan Roberts and Dr. Diva Iman. What are the interlinkages between the processes? So we'll have a legal perspective and policy perspective from Christina Giardi and Nicola Clark. And what are some of the practical considerations for driving ambitious biodiversity targets using the case study of Palau? So we have Gwen Sisio from Palau joining us today. Through these presentations, we hope to generate practical considerations from multiple perspectives for coherence between the processes. Following that, these presentations, we will look at challenges and try to develop a conversation on ways to overcome some of those challenges. Each of our panelists will have roughly 15 minutes, a little less as we progress, to deliver their remarks. And I just want to do a little bit of housekeeping, mention that this is a Zoom webinar. So other than the panelists, all other attendees' cameras have been disabled. But attendees will be able to ask questions through the Zoom webinar Q&A function, which you will see on the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. You can ask questions, and if you are willing, please identify yourself, or otherwise you could submit anonymous questions, which I will read to the panelists and they will respond. If we run out of time, I will ask also if the panelists could just reflect on the remarks within the context of their closing, reflect on your questions in the context of their closing remarks, which I'll give them a minute each to do. So without any further ado, let's turn to our first speaker, who is Dr. Kellan Roberts. Dr. Kellan Roberts has submitted a pre-recorded message because of the time zone differences. Just by way of introduction, he is a professor of marine conservation in the Center for Ecology and Conservation at the University of Exeter's Cornwall campus. He focuses on threats to marine ecosystems, species and on finding the means to protect them. His main interests include the documenting the impacts of fishing on marine life, both historic and modern, and exploring the theory and practical effectiveness of marine protected areas, which I will refer to as MPAs throughout, for conservation and fisheries management. For the last few decades, he has used science to make the case for stronger protection for marine life at both national and international levels. And now I will give Nicola the pleasure of broadcasting his presentation. Thank you very much.
Hello, I'm Kellan Roberts, and I'm Professor of Marine Conservation at the University of Exeter. In this presentation, I want to talk to you about the 30 by 30 target for marine protected areas and how this might be applied to areas beyond national jurisdiction. So the two questions I want to answer in this presentation are: why is 30% ocean protection necessary? And why is it that we should protect areas to a very high degree from exploitation and other sources of human threat and impact if we're going to have them achieve their conservation goals? So looking back in time, the 10% target by 2020, which has just expired, was originally set at the Convention on Biological Diversity's meeting in 2004, and it was very much a political target. At the time, less than 1% of the sea was protected, and 10% was seen to be achievable, even though it wasn't in the end, and not too daunting, in that if you'd set the bar higher, if we'd suggested having more protection, many countries might have been put off from signing up from the goal. So what sort of coverage target is actually justified by science? Well, these are the results of an analysis that a colleague of mine and my team did a few years ago, which looked at how much of the sea we would need to protect to achieve basic objectives for marine protected areas. And those include, for example, biodiversity protection, the representation of habitats and species, and also goals related to sustaining and supporting fisheries. MPAs can be very effective ways of supporting fisheries. What we found across this whole series of different objectives from a large number of studies is that we couldn't achieve those objectives with only a few percent of the ocean protected, as we had as we've had for most time up to now. But you need to get into several tens of percent ocean protection before you're up there and achieving or optimizing against these objectives. And what's interesting is that if you look at the kind of overall mean coverage of marine protected areas needed, it's about 37%. And you can see that the amount needed to achieve each of these different objectives for MPAs is very, very similar. So effectively, MPAs at this kind of level of coverage can achieve many goals simultaneously. The next question is, can we meet the 30 by 30 protection goal without areas beyond national jurisdiction? Obviously, a high seas treaty that allows marine protected area creation is going to be necessary to bring areas beyond national jurisdiction under protection. And, the awful that you can contemplate is that will not happen, that there won't be an effective high seas treaty. Well, if there wasn't one, we would find it enormously difficult to meet the protected areas coverage. So 39% of the global seas are under sovereign control by nations of the world. You would need to protect 3/4 of them if you were going to achieve 30% only in national waters. So 30 by 30 is only really achievable if we have a high seas treaty that allows us to create MPAs on the high seas. The second thing about the CBD's Aichi Target 11, this protecting 10% of the sea by 2020, is that it has to be ecologically representative. And if you look at the spectrum of habitats in global seas, you can't represent them without including areas beyond national jurisdiction. So it's a fundamental need for an effective international network of MPAs to have protected areas in areas beyond national jurisdiction. So how much do these open ocean waters need by way of protection? Well, one of the principles which has underpinned the creation of MPAs in many parts of the world is that if an activity is not believed to be threatening to protected species or habitats, then we should carry on doing it in those things. However, there are a couple of flaws that make this a really problematic principle. And one of those is the shifting baseline syndrome. And so we may be looking at impacted habitats, not recognizing that those impacts have happened, and therefore failing to apply a sufficient level of protection for wildlife to recover. And then a lack of scientific evidence is often taken as meaning that there is no impact, whereas absence of evidence is not evidence of absence of impact, and that's a problem too. The difficulty is that we see this all over the world. Here's the UK network of marine protected areas, 371 of them, and yet hardly any of it is protected from all fishing, and very little of it is protected from activities that are considered to be highly destructive, like bottom trawling and dredging. And the reason that we're here is because of those two kind of flaws in the application of this principle. When we do protect areas very highly or fully from extractive uses and harm, we see dramatic benefits. And in fact, the gold standard for marine protected areas is highly and fully protected marine areas. And in this kind of analysis, these had 7 times more fish than unprotected sites and double the biomass of partially protected sites. Now, if you apply that to the world's oceans, imagine that there are no marine protected areas at all. The amount of marine life has been reduced to a low level by exploitation. What would happen if we protected it to different levels? Well, if we were to protect 30% of it to a light or minimal level, which corresponds to the sort of level of protection that we get across much of the world's oceans right now, this is what we would achieve. If we were to protect it in fully or highly protected areas, we would achieve a great deal more in terms of wildlife recovery and comeback. And stacking these things up, the blue bar here at the top is no marine protected areas anywhere. That's the amount of marine life that you'd have. If you protected 30% of the ocean to a light or minimal level, you get a bit of an uplift in the overall amount of marine wildlife. But if you protected 30% to a high or full level, you get far more wildlife in the sea. And that's why it's so important to recovering marine life and the integrity and resilience of open ocean ecosystems. So within protected areas, what do we need to protect? Well, here's an example of an MPA which protects seamounts, very prevalent in areas beyond national jurisdiction. In this MPA, the seabed is protected, but the overlying waters are fished. And that's because there's a few assumptions being made. One is that fisheries management is fine and good and will prevent harm to fish and other wildlife. Already a questionable assumption given the kind of performance of much of fisheries management. Only sensitive features need protection, and the only sensitive features are those on the seabed. And another assumption is that there is an independence between seabed features and overlying waters. So you can expect the seabed to be quite happy if we don't protect the overlying waters. Are those justified assumptions? Well, we looked at them in detail and found considerable ecological connectivity across ocean depths from the seabed through the water column. And the conclusion is that you won't get natural intact ecosystem functioning if you only protect one or the other. You have to protect both, from the surface to the seabed. The other problem that we see in discussions about protection of the high seas is that the protection is applied to a place rather than to the wildlife. But if you're essentially exploiting the wildlife and considering an area protected, as we do in much of the UK's marine protected area network, then what do you get? Essentially, the habitat is considered by many people to be the water. That's not the sort of way that we approach habitats in coastal areas. And so on the left here, you can see that habitats in coastal areas are typically dominated by biodiverse organisms, biomass producing, biogenic habitat creating organisms like kelp, coral, seagrass, or oysters. And so we consider habitat protection to mean protecting those species. In the open ocean, what is the habitat? Is it water, or is it actually the wildlife that is there? The wildlife, I would say, is what structures those open ocean ecosystems. And so essentially, protecting the wildlife and the habitat are one and the same thing. And that's why we need to apply strong levels of protection to the species that are present in the high seas. So to sum up what I've just said, essentially 30% of the ocean being protected is a scientific target. It supplants this kind of political target that we had before, and reaching that level of 30% is necessary to achieve most of the common conservation goals and objectives for marine protected areas. If we want to achieve global coverage targets of 30% and the ecological representation target embedded in the Aichi targets, then we have to include areas beyond national jurisdiction. They need to be fully and highly protected if they're going to function effectively to protect open ocean wildlife, and there needs to be surface to seabed protection if they're going to protect intact functioning ecosystems that are going to build resilience against global change. Thank you very much.
That was an excellent presentation from Professor Calum Roberts, and he really does tease out some really critical issues that the BBNJ negotiations will have to address. First off, his point about the importance of the science-informed basis upon which we will develop our new High Seas Treaty, which brings into context the importance of the science policy interface, which is what we're about to discuss here. And also just making the case that simply put, we can't achieve 30 by 30 without including areas beyond national jurisdiction, which is a strong case for concluding the BBNJ treaty, which, quite frankly, it's decades now that we've been working on that treaty. And I think temporally, we need to think about what urgency means in that context. And I also appreciate the points he's raised about, the level of protection that will be needed with respect to MPAs, even on the high seas, and raising the issues of ecological connectivity, which is something that within the BBNJ treaty is still being debated, given the fact that under UNCLOS, we deal with zones, jurisdictional zones, which makes it very complicated to address that with more of a science perspective as opposed to a state jurisdictional perspective. Now we will turn to, great, and really regret that Professor Roberts isn't with us to engage in a conversation, but I hope you all appreciated that very insightful presentation. Now we will turn to Dr. Divaman, who will be speaking to the wider role of biodiversity conservation and the BBNJ treaty in tackling the climate crisis. Dr. Divaman is a marine biologist focused on the little known habitats and animals of the deep ocean and how our actions are impacting them. She works at the nexus of science, policy, and communication, and has a deep desire to see stewardship measures applied to the deep ocean, as well as the management of a broader group of global stakeholders towards this effort. In 2013, she completed her PhD at the University of Southampton, after which she spent 3 years at the University of Hawaii, researching abyssal fauna of the Clarion-Clipperton Zone. Diva then undertook a Marie Skłodowski-Curie Research Fellowship at the Natural History Museum in London. She has participated in multiple cruises around the world. I'm envious, exploring previously unknown deep sea habitats from Antarctica to the Mariana Trench. She's spoken at the UN, the Nobel Prize, as well as filmed with National Geographic, BBC, and CNN, amongst others. She's a 2020 National Geographic Emerging Explorer, a Pew Bartorelli Ocean Ambassador, and a World Economic Forum Friend of Ocean Action. She's the founder and director of Species, an NGO dedicated to marine science, education, and advocacy in her home country of Trinidad and Tobago. Dr. Aman, it's my pleasure to turn the mic over to you.
Thank you, Ambassador Felton, and good morning, good evening, good afternoon to everyone joining us. I'm just going to go ahead and share my screen. And apologies for the frogs that you can hear. They can be a bit overwhelming at this hour. Okay, right. You should be seeing my screen. Right, perfect. Okay, so before I begin, I'd love to say thank you for inviting me to participate in this panel today, as well as thank Dr. or rather Professor Lisa Levin of Scripps Institution of Oceanography and the Deep Ocean Stewardship Initiative, which I'm an executive member of, for her assistance in really providing these slides as sort of a base for me to work with. So today I'm really going to be chatting about that wider role of biodiversity conservation and that BBNJ treaty in tackling, of course, the climate change. So I'm going to ease us in gently. The ocean is our largest ecosystem, providing over 96% of habitable space on the planet, with most of that falling into areas beyond national jurisdiction, and most of that being deep ocean. And so, of course, for the most 100 years of deep sea science and exploration, it was thought to be just this big, boring, barren place on account of the near freezing temperatures, the crushing pressures, and the real scarcity of food. But as you can see from this video, we know now that thanks to new technology that there's incredible biodiversity living in a range of habitats in the deep ocean. So it's thought there are about 1 million species in our oceans, and 2/3 of those are still unknown. And of course, most of those are going to be in the deep sea and in areas beyond national jurisdiction, which are really poorly explored. And lucky for us, that biodiversity has given rise to many, many ecosystem services and functions that are absolutely crucial and valuable to keeping our planet healthy and keeping us alive. And that includes by regulating our climate, by absorbing heat and sequestering carbon, which we'll talk a little bit more about. So one of the most important services is the vital role of the ocean as a climate mitigator. It absorbs about 93% of all the heat generated by carbon dioxide emissions, and 26% of all the CO2 itself have been removed from the atmosphere by the ocean. And I always find the statistic like staggering, but the amount of heat uptake since 1997 is equivalent to a Hiroshima-style nuclear bomb going off every second for 75 years. And of course, most of that will occur in areas beyond national jurisdiction. But sadly, the sequestration capacity of the ocean is not unlimited, and its absorption capacity is not unlimited. And we're really seeing that the carbon being removed from the atmosphere really does depend on the capacity of the ocean and deep sea ecosystems in particular to maintain their functions. And of course, again, most of this will be in areas beyond national jurisdiction. And so this is all related to that intimate link between climate and biodiversity. So the deep ocean is highly connected to the atmosphere and to the surface of the ocean through the exchange of heat, through wind-driven upwelling of nutrients that promote carbon dioxide assimilation by phytoplankton, and of course by the vertical and horizontal export of that carbon via particle transport and the migration of animals. So basically, we mustn't forget that everything in the ocean, everything on the planet is linked. The deep sea with the ocean surface and the atmosphere, and of course, within national jurisdictions and areas beyond national jurisdictions. So a lot of connection. But biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction and the services provided by biodiversity are now under threat from rising carbon dioxide emissions. And the ocean is changing faster than at any time in the last 10 million years. And carbon dioxide emissions are altering ocean conditions, and that's leading to a real trifecta of ocean stresses: ocean warming, deoxygenation, and acidification, which are manifesting in a number of ways in the ocean. And these ocean changes, of course, are affecting biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction, from the surface all the way down to the deep sea. And that's through changing species distributions, changing migration routes, altering the ecosystem structure and the functions of these ocean habitats. And consequently, these impacts to biodiversity are ultimately impacting the ecosystem services provided by the ocean in areas beyond national jurisdiction. And that has the potential to wreak massive economic and ecological consequences, which will only increase in the future if we don't do something about the climate crisis. And then the worst news is that increasing human activities in areas beyond national jurisdiction are rapidly ramping up. We want more food, we want more energy, we want more raw materials from our high seas. And so we have a real, there's a really concerning scenario developing where we have cumulative impacts of climate-related changes in area beyond national jurisdictions, ocean environments, combined with human disturbances from resource extraction, pollution, and other human impacts. And really that has the ability to alter the services that we rely on, and again, reduce the ocean's resilience even further. So there are real concerns there. And so there is a real growing need to expand our knowledge of areas beyond national jurisdiction and the climate mitigation services that it provides, the ecosystem vulnerabilities, and of course, this all starts with the biodiversity that is there. And we need to incorporate that knowledge into stewardship of our areas beyond national jurisdiction. And so, of course, that's the place that we hope the Biodiversity Beyond National Jurisdiction Treaty or BBNJ Treaty is going to come in. And we know that climate change affects biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction and is a key consideration for the agreement. And that's going to be incorporated potentially in a variety of elements within that treaty. And we also know that that treaty can help address climate change and boost the resilience of the ocean. So we're having it both ways regarding biodiversity and the climate crisis from the BBNJ Treaty potentially. And so we know there are a number of pillars within the BBNJ Treaty. We have area-based management tools, EIAs, marine genetic, environmental impact assessments, marine genetic resources, and capacity building and technology transfer. And so I'm going to talk about 3 of those today and how really that BBNJ Treaty can really provide us with a potential solution if we do end up with a robust one. So in designated area-based management tools, including marine protected areas like we heard about from Professor Roberts, we really have the opportunity to develop and implement a BBNJ treaty agreement, that can recognize climate change and can function as that will not just recognize climate change, but recognize several things about climate change, that it can function as a stressor that increases vulnerability to physical disturbance and reduces resilience, that alters habitat suitability and representativity, changes connectivity patterns of populations or protected areas, redistributes species and modifies biodiversity. And so really we need to take all of that into account when we are designing and implementing our area-based management tools, including MPAs. They need to incorporate climate change scenarios and projections so that we can identify the most and the least vulnerable areas, including greenhouse gas sinks, which are of course essential in the climate crisis. We need to be able to designate climate refugia. We need to promote migration corridors and connectivity. And we need to assess representativity of MPA scenarios and quantify that potential habitat loss. And essentially, all of this will work towards increasing that resilience. And as we heard from Professor Roberts, from the seabed right the way up to the sea surface. And so regarding environmental impact assessments, of course, well, not of course, but unfortunately, not all human activities require an environmental impact assessment, as we can see from the top of the slide. But we do know that EIAs need to recognize climate change, and they really need to vary biodiversity independent of other stresses, but also be a source of, they need to they need to be able to show that biodiversity varies independent of other stresses, that the climate crisis could be a source of cumulative impacts, and that this ultimately will sort of end up with us having baseline analyses and assessments of not just single impacts, but cumulative impacts that include climate stresses and carbon footprints. And the scope of EIAs really does, again, need to include things like the assessment of the vulnerability to climate stresses, the assessment of ecosystem services provided by the area of interest, and also the potential impacts of that activity, as well as climate change to ecosystem services in that area. So it really has the opportunity to be quite a useful tool in, as the same with area-based management tools, in tackling the climate crisis. And so then we have technology transfer and capacity building. And so we know that we need new observations and tools in the areas beyond national jurisdiction to record climate change and its impacts. And we need to, through this measure especially, we need to be enabling all nations to understand, project, and adapt to climate change. And to do that, we really do need a global coordination of our high seas and our deep ocean science. And as a result of that global coordination, it's also hoped that there might be data sharing across the UN that can really facilitate sustainable development and use of ocean biodiversity. And this will give us the opportunity to not just get data, but also to raise awareness and improve climate literacy. It'll give us the opportunity to develop further policies to protect ecosystem services in the high seas from climate change. And really, we need to be pivoting, as we have on land, to show that carbon dioxide emissions and other greenhouse gases really do need to be regulated, their impacts documented, and their effects really accounted for. And through doing capacity building and technology transfer, we can enable more of a global stakeholder base to be able to do that. And so to end, I just want to sort of hammer home the points that the ocean really is our lifeboat, and I especially mean that for the high seas. And really, it's an incredibly important climate mitigator, and biodiversity is key to that climate mitigation. It is absolutely the sort of actors in that climate mitigation, in that climate crisis mitigation. And we know that, of course, even though they are key to mitigating climate change, we also know that they're very vulnerable to it via that warming, via that acidification, via that deoxygenation. So we need to recognize that climate change has the potential to create cumulative impacts. And we really need to begin to incorporate it as much as possible into our environmental planning on the high seas. And that involves, promoting marine science, building capacity and technology transfer, and really, again, allowing us to increase the resilience for the benefit of humankind and the planet. The BBNJ Treaty really has the ability, if it is a robust one, to transform the way that the high seas, of course, is managed. And I mean that from a perspective of managing the climate crisis and ensuring that the ocean is resilient, as resilient as possible to the climate crisis, and really protecting biodiversity is the key to do that. And so one last take home is that the Deep Ocean Stewardship Initiative has created a really great policy brief, Climate and Biodiversity Beyond the Limits of National Jurisdiction. And it has a lot of the points that were raised today. So please, if you do get a chance, go and check that out. It's a really great resource. And that is me.
Thank you very much, Dr. Amam, for that presentation, and really highlighting how everything interconnects when it comes to not only the ecosystem services provided for planetary sustainability, but also for purposes more directly on climate regulation. And that is something that's increasingly recognized within the context of the UNFCCC. They just concluded 2 ocean dialogues to discuss the nexus between climate and ocean. And I like the point that has often been reiterated, that ocean science is climate science. And so that's really important information you've provided, as well as looking at how the BBNJ can be a pathway to addressing some of these issues. And very useful to hear your perspectives on the various tools that are being negotiated within the context of the treaty that can address some of these issues. So the area-based management tools, the environmental impact assessment, as well as the importance of capacity building, technology transfer. And I think one of the things that we probably should discuss is, what exactly should the treaty spell out in terms of the area-based management tools. And I believe Christina will probably get us in there. And in terms of environmental impact assessments, as you rightly pointed we need to be able to address cumulative impacts. And instead of just focusing on EIAs, there is a discussion that has opened up on strategic environmental assessments and how that might be a way of addressing cumulative impacts. And on the capacity building and technology transfer, I think one of the issues that really has been weighing down on that whole discussion is whether or not that is going to be something that's simply put mandatory, not just a voluntary best effort type of provision. So now let me turn to, thank you again, Dr. Mann, and we'll come back to you. Let me remind our audience that please, you can use the Q&A function to ask questions. We will get to those questions. And in the event that there are questions that can be answered right away, the panelists can do that in the context of the Q&A function so please go ahead and put your questions in there. We look very much forward to hearing from you. So now let's turn to Christina Giardi, who has been involved in many, I know Christina from the BBNJ context, but you're involved in so many other processes. And so we very much welcome your insight, and your topic will be building ocean and institutional resilience through enhanced cooperation and coordination, including between the Convention on Biological Diversity and the future BBNJ agreement. By way of introduction, Christina is a senior high seas advisor to IUCN's Global Marine and Polar Program, an adjunct professor at the Middlebury Institute of International Studies at Monterey, California, where she teaches marine and international marine law. And for the past 20 plus years, she has focused on the nexus of law, science, and policy relating to sustained marine biodiversity beyond national jurisdictions. She's authored or co-authored over 150 publications, many with leading ocean scientists. To advance science-based progress, Christina co-founded and currently serves on the boards of 4 initiatives: DOSI, Diva just referred to one of their publications, Global Ocean Biodiversity Initiative, Sargasso Sea Project, and the High Seas Alliance. Christina is also a member of the Interim Advisory Board of the UN Decade of Ocean Science, which is currently underway through to 2030, an advisor to the Schmidt Ocean Institute and the Atlantic Project, and an honorary fellow of the School of Geosciences at the University of Edinburgh. Christina received her JD from the New York University School of Law with a focus on comparative and international law, and practiced admiralty law for several years in New York City. She currently is in Cambridge. Christina, over to you.
Well, thank you very much for the generous introduction, and thank you to the hosts for organizing this session. I actually get to say good morning to everybody, even though the sun is well on to setting here in Cambridge. That's what I'm going to try to do, is to talk and look at how these Convention on Biological Diversity and the Convention and the Emerging Agreement for Marine Biodiversity Beyond National Jurisdiction overlap, complement, and in fact help to build the resilience of our ocean as well as our institutions. That's, I think you've already heard BBNJ, short for Biodiversity Beyond National Jurisdiction, developing an international legally binding agreement. I need to give credit to my co-author here, Siddharth Shekhar Yadav. We are the co-authors of the paper that this is discussion is being based upon, and he's also helped me with many of the slides here. So with that, I will move forward and start out with my end, which is in case I run out of time. But the 4 takeaways that I would love you to go away with, which is that the Convention on Biological Diversity has a critical role to play in areas beyond national jurisdiction by setting a common table that we all can benefit from, and common targets, common goals, as well as a common sense of responsibility for better integrating and managing biological diversity in all of its components, including marine biological diversity within and beyond national jurisdiction. As Ambassador Filson pointed out, I'm not a scientist. I'm perhaps a wannabe scientist who's fascinated by learning what I can from different fields. And what I'm trying to glean is some lessons that we can learn from resilience theory in ecology, as well as socio-ecological systems, the institutions that we use to manage our ocean. We need resilience in both of those, especially as Diva was mentioning, we're living in an era of rapid change. And so I will be summing up with trying to say that both the CBD and the BBNJ agreement together, together and as a whole, can help to better ensure a resilient global ocean and a resilient global ocean governance framework. Because, as you can see, the ocean is really one ocean. We can talk about different basins, but it is intimately connected. And I think, to my mind, I still have not seen an illustration that just describes this as well as this map, the results of the 10-year census of marine life that occurred from 2000 to 2010, that was focused on discovering the diversity, distribution, and abundance of marine life. And through that program, they developed technologies to allow the tagging and tracking of individual animals, like bluefin tuna as they swam across the ocean and back, like loggerhead and leatherback sea turtles as they paddled their way across hemispheres, and seabirds that were flying from pole to pole. It really helps to underscore how we are intimately connected by these ocean basins. But we're also intimately connected to the feedback loops, both good and bad, of what is happening to our global ocean. Weak governance makes the impacts that we're undergoing far worse. What we've learned is that all of these impacts act synergistically, and the results of any one can be far worse than any of the issues if they were dealt with in isolation. And that gives rise to the need for resilience, is how do you actually build the capacity of an ecosystem or an institution to withstand sudden shocks, changes, and unexpected results from these synergistic effects. So how I'm going to approach this is trying to underscore the relevance of convention on biological diversity, which is where I first started my work on areas beyond national jurisdiction, as Ambassador Felsen said, some 20 plus years ago, but also talk you into a little bit on resilience theory, at least how I see it, and build on the 7 resilience principles that the Stockholm Resilience Center put together also many years ago. And what does this actually mean for the BBNJ agreement and the institutions and the architecture that we all share? I like this jellyfish because it's sort of looking up and down and all around. And so we definitely need to be looking forward. We also need to be using all of our senses and all of our tools that we have today, as well as tomorrow, to share responsibility for a fragile planet. We've heard about the role of the Law of the Sea Convention as setting forth the overarching framework of rights and responsibilities. But it's not the only game in town, but we need all of these institutions to be fulfilling their part in the wider circle. And when they don't, that's again the problem of efficiency. If you put all your bucks in one bag and that bag gets stolen, then you're left with nothing. So the idea is to spread your risk by sharing the responsibility across multiple institutions for actually helping to maintain the health and resilience of our global ocean commons. As you heard, the Law of the Sea Convention creates a very fundamental obligation on all states to protect and preserve the marine environment, but it lacks the implementation tools and mechanisms to actually bring this to life. Who's responsible for it? The Convention on Biological Diversity came 10 years later that set forth a more specific framework in terms of biological diversity by affirming that conservation of biological diversity is, in fact, a common concern of humankind, looking both within and beyond national jurisdiction. It recognized, as the Law of the Sea Convention also does, that all states have the responsibility to ensure that their activities under their jurisdiction and control do not cause damage to areas beyond the limits of national jurisdiction. And it calls on states to cooperate both directly and through international organizations to make sure this happens. That it does recognize that specific provisions of the Convention on Biological Diversity apply with respect to components of biological diversity, the species, the habitats, the protected areas within the limits of national jurisdiction. But at the same time, it recognizes, again, that duty not to cause harm to areas beyond national jurisdiction through an obligation to control processes and activities, both regardless of where the effects occur, both within and beyond national jurisdiction. What we're seeing is really the necessity of this joined up approach, the integration of these biological diversity considerations into all of our activities, all of our sectors, and in all of our daily lives. And this is also the case with climate change. As we've been hearing, is oceans and climate change are interlinked. Well, the Convention on Biological Diversity has been giving good guidance since before 2010, but this was when this decision was adopted. It inviting and calling on states, all parties, all governments, and as well as all citizens and organizations to do what they can to reduce the impacts of climate change on biodiversity, as well as biodiversity-based livelihoods, and set forth many of the elements that we've heard that the BBNJ agreement is in fact trying to operationalize. Everything from reducing non-climatic stress, reduce climate-related stress through integrated management, strengthen protected area networks, including connectivity corridors, integrating biodiversity into wider seascape management, that strategic environmental assessment that Ambassador Felsen was talking about. And then again, facilitating adaptive management by strengthening monitoring and evaluation systems that actually have that loop, that go back to inform both policy, management, evaluation, and rethinking those decisions. So I had the joy of having a trip up to Stockholm to visit the Stockholm Resilience Center and the Stockholm Swedish Academy of Sciences, and I discovered the Stockholm Resilience Center. What's the basis? Well, resilience theory. And as an international lawyer, I said, this looks like another tool to see global ocean governance, international laws and relations. How can we actually start to apply it? So I've been thinking about this for some while and had the pleasure, as I said, of working with Siddhar Shekhar Yadav, who couldn't be here tonight. So the first place to start is really, what is resilience? Well, it's defined in multiple ways, but one way is at least the capacity of a socio-ecological system to sustain a desired set of ecosystem services, or policy service, if you will, in the face of disturbance, ongoing evolution, and change. And one thing we do know is that the ocean is changing dramatically, and that this is going to put new stressors on our institutions. We'll need to develop new mechanisms for responding in a timely manner. So here are the 7 principles, and I'm going to walk us through these very quickly, one by one, because think both ecosystems and institutions maintain diversity and redundancy. As I said, don't put all your money in one bag. You need to be spreading that responsibility in order to increase the diversity and redundancy of institutions capable of acting to conserve biological diversity, just as you need abundance and diversity of genes of species in order to maintain the stability of ecosystems. You need to recognize and manage connectivity within and beyond national jurisdiction to make sure that the benefits of actions within national jurisdiction help to improve ocean health, but similarly to make sure that adverse effects activities within national jurisdiction do not undermine the health beyond national jurisdiction, and vice versa. Managing slow variables and feedbacks is, we need to be prepared that some things take a long time, that shifting baseline, that all of a sudden, whoop, you've got a new state of the planet. We're seeing a little bit of that with the climate change, with the amazingly hot temperatures that we've seen in different parts of the world in just the past week. And the core thing here is be prepared for surprises, but also keep your eye on the ball and make sure you're not taken by surprise to the extent you can avoid it. And that, of course, takes constant learning, constant innovation, and multiple perspectives. And then just continuing around this circle, encourage learning. That's not rocket science, but we all need to continue learning from each other. And the best way to do that is through broad-based participation, making sure that scientists are part of all these institutional decision-making processes. Make sure that there is voice and representation for the ocean and future generations while we're taking these very serious decisions. And then, of course, promoting polycentric governance systems. I learned a little bit about this from Eleanor Ostrom, and I'm now studying it much more. But the core thing here is, when you have multiple institutions, if they don't interact and respect and adjust to one another and have some form of conflict resolution mechanism, you don't have a polycentric governance system. You have a fragmented and mutually incoherent, and at sometimes competing system, which some might say is what we've got today. So with colleagues at IUCN, we had a wonderful illustrator trying to translate this article by Sid and myself into pictures. So I'm just going to quickly walk this through, is that it's a series of component parts. Ecological resilience means we all need to work together to defend biodiversity, redundancy, establish those MPA networks, make sure you have connectivity, and also that 100% sustainability is also critically important. We're talking about 30% highly or fully protected, but at the same time, we have to make sure that there's sanity prevailing outside of those islands of precaution and biodiversity. When you look at the institutions that we're using to govern these things, these are also subject to rapid shocks, change in course, and new conditions. And resilience theory suggests the best way to do this is constant monitoring, constant evaluation, constant learning, making sure that you have that source of scientific information and other voices to actually inform your decision making. But these institutions don't operate alone. They're actually part of a wider system. So that's where the polycentric governance comes in. We need to be able to plan together based on common rules, common understanding, and a common vision. And this is where the work going on in the Convention on Biological Diversity is so important right now to really help set that framework in our policymakers. And I really hope that there are negotiators who are attending both processes and the climate process, is we need to bring the ideas, the experiences, and the recognition of the fundamental change in our planet and the interdependence of biodiversity and ocean health and climate health, if we are going to make sure that all arms go forward, all institutions of governance act together. At the same time, we need to acquire that accountability, transparency, participation. Let's monitor and report on what we're doing to make sure we truly have all hands on deck. So trying to bring this all together, it is clear that we need multiple arms working together, but at the same time, we need to recognize that there needs to be a leadership of a global vision, global mechanisms to bring that cooperation, recognize that sometimes there are conflicting priorities, but we also need these conflicts need to be resolved in light of our shared overarching global aim. And that is indeed for ecological and institutional health, productivity, and resilience. I can't leave without giving a plug for the Decade of Ocean Science, and which is actually in many ways such an important vehicle to bring all the players on board to better understand both their local ecosystems within national jurisdiction and the connectivities beyond national jurisdiction, as well as to their neighboring states. So with that, I'll say thank you. And if you have any questions or would like a copy of the article, please feel free to reach out. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Christina. As usual, a very impactful presentation. I do want to tease out a little bit the discussion around the polycentric governance issues, because I think it's come up now in all the presentations. And we'll have an opportunity to do that after we hear our next speaker, who is Miss Nicola Clark, and she will be going into further how the BBNJ treaty can help deliver a global target to protect 30% of the ocean by 2030. Nicola is an officer on the Protecting Ocean Life on the High Seas team at the Pew Charitable Trust, where she is directly involved in the negotiations for the new High Seas Treaty, or BBNJ agreement. Nicola is a PhD candidate at the University of Wollongong's Australian National Centre for Ocean Resources and Security, where her research focuses on area-based management tools and institutional arrangements for the BBNJ agreement. She's also a member of the 6th cohort of Homeward Bound, a global leadership program for women in STEM. Prior to Anchors and Pew, Nicola worked on international fisheries issues at the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, or NOAA, and also on deep sea and high seas research at the Institute for Advanced Sustainability Studies. She received her master's degree in environmental management from Duke University. Nicola, I will now turn the mic over to you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Felsen. And it's such a pleasure to be with you all today. Let me just get my screen shared. And hopefully that's working for everyone. So as Ambassador Felsen mentioned, today I'm going to be giving a quick overview of the BBNJ negotiations, how the process is going, and then also talking a little bit more about its role in achieving some of those 30 by 30 goals. So I'll start out with a very brief reminder of why we need a high seas treaty in the first place. The core issue, the problem, as it were, is that there are several critical governance gaps on the high seas. We have a fragmented puzzle of organizations that manage different aspects of human activities in different areas on the high seas with varying degrees of effectiveness. And they typically don't do a great job of coordinating with each other. And it's in this messy patchwork approach to high seas governance that key things have slipped through the cracks. Namely, there's no legal mechanism to establish a comprehensive marine protected area, comprehensive marine protected areas in the high seas. And there's also no global obligation to conduct environmental impact assessments for activities that are taking place there. And this problem on the high seas is magnified by their vast scale. The high seas make up 2/3 of the ocean, and they cover almost half of this planet's surface. So on this map there, it's probably a little tiny on your screens, but the map on the right, all of those areas in dark blue are the high seas. And of course, high seas ecosystems are inextricably linked to those in coastal waters. So the stakes are high for the high seas. It will impact most of the ocean, its life, and by extension, the services a healthy ocean provides. Finally, and this has been touched on by previous speakers, in particular, Dr. Roberts, Professor Roberts, but it would be almost impossible to achieve a 30% ocean protection target without protecting the high seas. Currently, only about 1% of the high seas are protected, and almost all of that 1% comes from the Ross Sea MPA and the Southern Ocean, which is a very special case, both legally and biologically speaking. So in case anybody needs a refresher on the acronyms, because I know we've been speaking in acronyms on the panel, but BBNJ, as I think Christina and others have mentioned, stands for Marine Biological Diversity Beyond National Jurisdiction. And the objective of the BBNJ agreement is the conservation and sustainable use of BBNJ. But more specifically, it's charged with considering a package of issues. And those package of issues are marine genetic resources, area-based management tools, including marine protected areas, environmental impact assessments, and then all supported by capacity building and the transfer of marine technology. And so we won't have a BBNJ agreement until we've sorted out all of these package issues together and as a whole. And then in addition to these sort of very specific element issues, there's also a whole other suite of issues that we refer to as cross-cutting issues, those that cut across cut across different elements of this package, or are perhaps just general in nature. And I also wanted to note, it may be important for our discussions later on, that these negotiations tend to be led by members of foreign affairs, that part of the government. But from our perspective, it's critical that there's good engagement with and participation from environment ministries as well as those of foreign affairs. So again, something maybe that we might pick up on later on. So it has been a long and winding road to get where we are today with the BBNJ Treaty. The United Nations has been talking about BBNJ for almost 20 years now. In 2004, the UN began to acknowledge that these high seas areas maybe needed a little more attention. There were some key issues that needed to be addressed. And then in 2006, they convened an ad hoc informal working group meeting to discuss BBNJ issues generally. They met annually until 2015, when there was, we moved up and then we had an informal, when the informal working group launched preparatory committee meetings, who would decide whether or not they would actually launch formal negotiations. Anyway, for those in the UN, it maybe makes a little bit more sense, but for those of us who are new to this process, it's a lot to take in. But really, for me, one of the most exciting moments came as a Christmas gift on December 24th of 2017, when the UN adopted a resolution that formally launched formal negotiations for a high seas treaty. The fourth and final meeting of negotiations was supposed to take place in March of 2020, but of course was postponed due to the pandemic. It was again supposed to take place this coming August, next month, but again, because of the pandemic, it's been postponed yet again until sometime in 2022. So even though the last official meeting that took place for negotiations was in August of 2019, it doesn't mean that work on BBNJ has stopped. There's been a lot of informal work on this topic in the intervening years, both officially through the UN, they use Teams, the Teams discussion page, and there are also a number of sort of less official sites. There's the Nobel Institute has had a series of dialogues where negotiators can meet to sort of informally discuss some of these issues. And then there's a whole variety of webinars that different organizations and institutions have put on to try and dig in a little bit deeper to some of the key outstanding questions that remain. And in case anybody is unfamiliar but wants to learn more, you can find a whole slew of official documents on the UN website, www.un.org/BBNJ. There you can find the latest version of the actual draft text that we're all working off of. So going back to this panel, we're talking about interlinkages between different governance processes. But before I get into that, I want to first talk a little bit about ecosystem linkages. And we've heard, of course, a lot about ecosystem linkages from Dr. Amon, as well as Professor Roberts. You know, I'm going to talk a little bit more about the connectivity between high seas and coastal waters. So in this first map, we're reminded of how little respect migratory animals give to maritime boundaries. Tunas and whales and turtles and seabirds don't really care if they're in the high seas or within an exclusive economic zone. These are artificial jurisdictions that we humans have come up with. This other map I really like because it demonstrates just how interconnected some of these high seas areas are to coastal waters. So this is a map from Popova et al. That shows the time that it takes for ocean surface waters originating in the high seas to reach the coastal zones off of the eastern and then northwestern coast of Africa. And I think it really helps to demonstrate, again, just how interconnected ocean processes and ecosystems are. And finally, I think the leatherback turtle is just a fabulous example of this link between high seas and coastal waters. Leatherback turtles spend most of the year on the high seas, but they travel, of course, to coastal areas to lay their eggs. And there have been studies that have shown, you know, despite efforts to conserve these endangered species in certain areas like Costa Rica, for example, the Pacific leatherback turtle population fell by more than 95% over a 20 to 30 year period. A decline that scientists attribute largely to deaths as bycatch in the pelagic longline fishery. So although protecting nesting areas on coastal beaches is vital to the leatherback turtle recovery, it's equally critical that these creatures be protected from harmful fishing practices in their high seas habitat. In short, the health of the high seas and its biodiversity is inextricably linked to the health of coastal waters. So if we want to protect 30% of the high seas, which places of the high seas should we work to protect first? So although there are a lot of data gaps in the high seas, we know enough information to come up with a decent answer, at least an answer that can get us started. So my team at Pew worked with a team of scientists led by Dr. Doug McCauley at the University of California at Santa Barbara, who helped to identify the best data and finalize a methodology that would carry out an analysis to answer this question. Specifically, these scientists looked at biological features such as species richness, species endangerment, etc., as well as ecological, geographical, and habitat features such as productivity, presence of seamounts and vents, and habitat diversity. They then used a prioritizing algorithm to identify areas in the high seas that were sort of hotspots of these features. And all of this resulted in two products. So the first was a peer-reviewed paper with the results of the analysis, showing which areas of the high seas should be prioritized for protection. And then there was a follow-up, we did a follow-up Pew report that shed a little bit more light on some of just a handful of these priority areas to really dig in on the narrative, translating the science into maybe a more user-friendly general audience narrative to talk about why these places are so incredible and important. And I'll provide links to both of those at the end of this presentation. I think the most challenging piece of the Pew report was narrowing down our list of high seas places to highlight, but eventually we had to come up with a list of only 10. And I thought I would just go into a very quick deep dive on one of those, just so that you will have a sense of how incredible some of these high seas spaces are. So the Arabian Sea, it's a combination of features in this region, including the sea's geographically restricted, highly saline and warm surface waters, which drive the stratification of oxygen in the water column. This area is also known as an extreme oxygen minimum zone, a distinct and rare feature between depths of 200 and 1,000 meters. And it's indicative of a highly populated space in the water column with a high level of oxygen consumption by species present, which leads to nearly no freely available oxygen available to the rest of the ecosystem. And this area is hospitable to unique fauna such as lanternfish, flying squid, pelagic crabs. These Arabian Sea waters have an unusually high presence of mesopelagic animals that travel up and down daily through the water column in search of food and protection. The zone is also home to unique deep sea creatures that have adapted to such low oxygen conditions, as well as large predators such as squid, ribbonfish, tuna, and billfish that rely on the mesopelagic animals as a key food source. course, Dr. Amon had the most amazing visuals that talked about some of the amazing critters and organisms that live in these areas, but wanted to do another deep dive, just a deep dive from our Pew report of special places on the high seas. But in order to protect these places on the high seas, we need to have a treaty in place that enables the global community to establish high seas MPAs. As our moderator reminded us, we're meant to be thinking about practical considerations and implications. So a couple of specific pieces that will be critical to include in the BBNJ agreement in order to realize these 30 by 30 ambitions that we will hopefully have under a future CBD target. So first, the BBNJ treaty, we need a BBNJ treaty that creates a conference of parties that is empowered to establish comprehensive MPAs, as well as, and this is just as critical, associated management measures with those MPAs. This sort of speaks to the highly and fully protected being the gold standard of protected areas that Professor Roberts spoke about earlier today. And in particular, what we want to see is the establishment of a network of representative and well-connected MPAs. Another related point is to note that we can't rely solely on existing organizations to carry out this work. We need a new treaty because there are gaps, and we need a new treaty to fill them. And indeed, as I mentioned earlier, for most of the high seas, there is no governance organization that is empowered to establish comprehensive MPAs on the high seas. Another sort of key need and key ask specifically for the treaty is the institutional framework. So just a couple of key pieces there that we need to have. We need a conference of parties as a decision-making organ, and one that strives for consensus but has a qualified majority voting alternative for when consensus isn't possible. We can look to some challenging lessons learned in other areas about the challenges of consensus decision-making. We also need to make sure that we have a robust scientific body that's composed of qualified experts who are acting in their individual capacity rather than constrained by sort of a national policy. And while we, of course, would want to see this as a scientific advisory body, we would want to see a system built such that the advice of the scientific committee is incentivized to be followed by decision makers. We've seen examples in other bodies where you have robust science that then isn't exactly adopted in the decisions by those decision makers. We also want to see the establishment of a dedicated compliance or implementation committee to provide assistance with implementing this agreement, assure that it has high levels of accountability. And we'd also want to see an ecosystem approach and precautionary principle included in the final text, not merely a reference to it, but also indicators of what implementation of the precautionary principle, for example, would look like for the purposes of conserving and sustainably using BBNJ. We could look to, for example, the fish stocks agreement for inspiration on how we might think about doing that. And going back to some of the key challenges, Dr. Amon mentioned the challenge of cumulative impacts of multiple activities and stressors in the same area. So one of the things that we need from the BBNJ agreement is empowering and equipping it to take a holistic multi-sector perspective and to coordinate and cooperate across different governance institutions with that holistic perspective in mind, so that we have a better chance of considering and tackling those cumulative impact challenges. And then Dr. Amon also had a number of other really important recommendations and suggestions with regard to ABMTs and EIAs, as well as capacity building, which is super critical, and I haven't spoken much about it, but I would just echo all of her recommendations. Couple of takeaways before I conclude. So first is that the BBNJ treaty can fill critical ocean governance gaps, and if negotiators are ambitious and successful, the BBNJ treaty can, in particular, establish a legal mechanism to create high seas MPAs. A second point is just to say that the time to act is now. Negotiations are set to take place hopefully sometime in early 2022. But there are opportunities to engage in this dialogue intersessionally. We need governments to act ambitiously and urgently. The health of the oceans and our planet depend on it. The fate of the high seas and the areas beyond national jurisdiction, the fates of the high seas and coastal waters are intertwined. We need to have healthy high seas in order to support healthy ocean ecosystems on the whole. And finally, in order to achieve this goal of protecting 30% of the ocean by 2030, high seas have to be part of that solution. And for the high seas to be part of the solution, you need to have a robust BBNJ treaty in place as soon as possible. With that, I will thank you for your time and attention. I've included some links to the papers I referenced, and happy for you to get in touch with any questions. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Nicola. Thank you for that very comprehensive presentation on where we stand in respect of the BBNJ and the governance gaps that would necessarily be able to fill. But underscoring, of course, the need to ensure that it is robust, that it's ambitious, that it addresses the very issues that we've heard the other panelists speak about in terms of ecological connectivity, ensuring that we are able to protect marine biodiversity in ways that will actually make a difference, and not just something on paper. Thanks also for highlighting that institutional framework. That's really key to the treaty and its effectiveness. And certainly, I think the points that you raised about the scientific body and how do we ensure that it is positioned in a way that the advice and recommendations that come out from a scientific body can effectively be followed within the context of largely a political decision-making entity. So, and I think that's also useful if we think back to the discussion that Professor Roberts started off with, you know, where the CBD initial targets were basically politically defined. And now we're really at the stage where we need scientifically informed targets so that our actions can equally be so scientifically informed. Now let me turn to our dear friend Gwen Sisior from Palau, and she will be addressing, you know, how we translate global ambition into action towards a goal of what the main theme of this entire global dialogue, which is living in harmony. Gwen serves as a coordinator in the Environmental Planning and Coordination Unit within the Office of the Minister of the Ministry of Agriculture, Fisheries and the Environment in the Republic of Palau. She's responsible for overseeing the planning, development and coordinated implementation of grants at the ministry level. Gwen also negotiates on behalf of Palau in the CBD context, where she has pushed for more emphasis on marine and invasive species issues, as well as increased support for small island developing states in the implementation of the convention. Her unique position allows her to translate the decisions and outcomes that are taken at the international level to actual work on the ground, so operational through projects to ensure that Palau achieves its biodiversity priorities, but at the same time meets its obligations under the CBD convention. Gwen, you have the mic.
Wirtutao. My name is Gwen Seashore, as the Honorable Ambassador had note. I apologize, I'm very nervous right now. I don't have a presentation, but I wanted to basically speak on how Palau sees these entire processes and how that translates into national implementation. So to start off, I want to sort of tell you how Palau sees or defines what living in harmony means. And really for us, it means about how we can sustain our natural resources to be able to then, so that we can continue our livelihoods today, tomorrow, and even for our future generations, so that they can still enjoy the same things that we do now. So that has always been sort of our national priority, but it's always been one of the things that we do as part of our culture, as part of our tradition. So Palau has always implemented the Bul, which is basically a method that high chiefs would put a moratorium on either locations or even in certain species, so that it can minimize the impact, so that the resource can recover, or that it can be sustained, so that we do not over abuse or over exploit these resources. That traditional method that we're using, again, was really about how to ensure the sustainability of our natural resources. From that, we then learned that we started that this has to be a national effort. So we started the Protected Areas Network program here in Palau. And in a way, it was part of its having state governments recognize that they have, who are the resource owners, recognize that there are biodiversity rich areas that needs to be protected, because in most times that's the resource that is either being impacted or is the resources that, for example, in certain marine areas serve as nursery. So we needed to protect that area to ensure that the fish is constantly being populated so that we could still enjoy that natural resource. We took that one step further into creating sharks and mammal sanctuaries within Palau's waters. And this is sort of an expansion of our protected areas network. The idea of the protected areas network, although it wasn't really to a specific location, it's just the entire waters of Palau. We note the importance of the sharks as well as mammal species, the marine mammal species. So we decided that we'd also put that bull for those species to protect them. Palau then also realized that while we were protecting all these species in the marine, so the PAN program focused more on the marine coastal areas. The shark sanctuary and the marine mammal sanctuaries covered all our waters, but it wasn't really it was a species specific protection. But Palau realized that we also needed to protect other species other than sharks and marine mammals. So then the idea of the Palau National Marine Sanctuary came about. And that Palau National Marine Sanctuary really was an opportunity for Palau to take back the ownership of our resources, because really prior to the PNMS, our EEZ are the resources that Palau had within its EEZ were taken by other countries and then taken outside of the Palau. So really, Palauans did not benefit from that natural resources. It was other countries. So the PNMS was a way for us to basically take back our resource, but also to help manage that resource. And we knew that we needed to, with the science behind fisheries, noting the loss of fish stocks and how fish stocks are declining, we needed to protect an area that would allow them to then recover. So that was part of why we also wanted to do the PNMS. It was also an effort to also ease the pressures on our reef fishes, because our reef fishes were being, so while our pelagics were being taken by foreign vessels, Palauans then relied a lot on our reef fishes. So it created a lot of impact on our reef fishes. So we knew that if we can close the PNMS, steer those resources towards Palauans so that they can benefit from the natural resources within our EEZ, then it will also help reduce the pressures on our reef fishes, which is why we're pushing for Palauans to choose pelagics so that we can focus, so we can help our reefs recover. So really, these are national priorities to fulfill what we define as living in harmony with nature, which is sustaining our resources so that we can continue to sustain our livelihoods. But as we've seen from the previous presentation by Dr. Roberts, the science is that 30% at least 30% of our oceans have to be protected. And that's a global law, and we hope that that will be the global ambition in the global biodiversity framework. But nationally, what that means to us is about really, again, protecting our natural resources. So through the PAN program, we did achieve 30% of our marine, and with the PNMS now, we've achieved that 30% at the national level. But we know that we are connected to everyone, to our neighboring countries, to the entire planet, that we are just a part of an entire ecosystem, that in order to ensure that our resources retain, and we've seen from the presentation from Ms. Clark, especially on the turtles, that even though we're doing what we can at the national level, that our species can still be impacted and that our natural resource can still decline if we do not address it as well beyond our borders. So this is why Palau has been participating a lot and pushing a lot in the CBD conventions and in the BBNJ conventions to try and get that protection, to work with other countries to ensure that we are working towards that protection, so that not only does Palau, but also globally, that we're able to still sustain resources so that we can sustain our livelihoods and moving forward. So these global ambitions themselves is really about, at the national level, is a way for us to be able to still sustain our natural resources within our country. But to do that, we also need the help, and that's why these international conventions are very critical. So not only for biodiversity, which is looking within the national jurisdiction, but also BBNJ and looking outside. Some of the efforts that Palau has done also is being part of the parties to the Nauru Agreement, which is basically a group of 8 Pacific Island countries that are focusing on managing the tuna fisheries or tuna species within our waters, our national jurisdictions, so that we ensure that we're not that we set a specific what we call vessel day schemes to ensure that we're still using the resources, but we're managing the use of that resources so that we don't overexploit or overuse that resources. So I apologize, I don't have a presentation, but that's basically sort of how we see these international conventions and how these global ambitions will help us achieve our national priorities of sustainably managing our resources, but also allowing sustainable use of those resources. So I apologize, my presentation is really short, but I'm more than happy to answer questions.
No apologies needed, Gwen. I think it's really impressive to know, to learn of what Palau has done relative to its size and capacity. But your ambition overwhelms many of us, indeed, many countries. And it's certainly something to draw inspiration from, but also encouragement of what can be done. I think the leadership from Palau and other small island developing states is something that is certainly worth highlighting. SIDS have certainly been, not only in the context of CBD, but in the context of the BBNJ, advancing really progressive ideas on how we can have a robust treaty, not only in terms of the processes that we're setting out, but also in terms of the institutional frameworks that would be needed. Drawing, of course, on our own, I'm saying our because I am from Belize, and I do negotiate as part of small island developing states, but our own recognition of our own limitations and the need that we have for capacity building and technology transfer. So thank you so much for that, Gwen. I think it's really important that we, especially in light of the theme of this entire global dialogue, look at that conservation ethos that Palau has, that's linked to that intergenerational equity. I think it's really a very strong message that you've made. Also, the extent to which Palau draws on science to inform its policies, and looking not only within its national jurisdiction, but beyond. So actually giving us an example of this connectivity that we can have, going beyond those zonal views of how states tend to think. I think that's something that needs to be highlighted in the global context. And thank you also for sharing that the experience that Palau and other small and developing states in the Pacific have had with the Nauru Agreement, which is an excellent example of these states taking control of the resource that they have and doing it in a sustainable way. And something I think across the globe, others are taking very well note of. So I will now turn to the Q&A section of this session of this discussion. And I've been very ably assisted by our colleague Sebastian. And we'll open up the floor with 3 questions, each in turn. So the first question, drawing on the comments that have been raised in the Q&A chat, it relates to looking at the difficulties of identifying the most vulnerable or most at risk areas of the high seas. So Diva Amma noted the need to protect those areas of the high seas that are most vulnerable or most at risk. We heard also from Professor Kellen Roberts, as well as from Nicola, on the areas that potentially could be subject to management or area-based management. And the question we have for the speakers is, could you elaborate on the difficulties of identifying the most vulnerable or most at-risk areas of the high seas, while scientific knowledge of high seas ecosystem remains weak or incomplete? So let me throw that question out to you. I'm not sure who would want to be the first taker of that. Diva, maybe I could turn to you first.
Sure. I mean, that's a really big question, but just because there are so many different ways in which vulnerable can be vulnerable or important can be defined. I think there is, of course, and I hope that Nicola and Christina and Gwen will chime in after this, but I think there's, of course, ecological characteristics, like, for instance, those are used by the FAO to define vulnerable marine ecosystems, or by the CBD to define ecologically and biologically significant areas, or EBSAs. And so that will be things like structural complexity, the presence of various like reproductive stages, or particular interest in breeding, not interest, function in the reproduction of various animals, the presence of potentially old taxa, so the presence of potentially very diverse or very abundant taxa. I mean, there's a range of ways in which we can measure this, and of course that extends as well to what are the functions of these habitats as well. But I think, you know, there's also this flip side of beyond the ecological characteristics, but if we're talking about vulnerable places, you also need to take into account not just ecological characteristics, not just the functions, like whether they are carbon sinks, etc., but also how vulnerable they are. So what are the emerging, how likely are they to be impacted by some type of human activity on the high seas, for instance? And so I think a great example of that, which doesn't necessarily fall into, well, partially falls into the jurisdiction of the BBNJ treaty, is that of seabed mining. We know that this is potentially going to occur over huge areas, swaths of the sea floor potentially. And so really a vulnerable area might emerge that is one that is vulnerable to that in a short time frame, potentially. So I'm going to stop there and hope that Nicola and Christina rescue me, and Gwen can rescue me.
No, that's a great start to it, because I you know, with the BBNJ treaty, what we're talking about is setting standards. So let me turn to Christina to then pick up from where you left off, Diva.
Okay, I'll repeat. It's a really big question, and we could spend the next 2 hours on this. But I think it's important to remember the context of this is at least 30% protected. When the CBD went through this exercise back 10 years ago, they actually said, well, there are some vulnerable types of ecosystems that should be 100% protected. You know, this was the corals and the seamounts and the hydrothermal vents. But then somehow it sort of got washed out in the consensus building. But we have to remember that the protected areas have to live in the sea of sustainability. So we also need these standards set in the BBNJ agreement for environmental impact assessments, consistent with SDG 14.2, which is talking about preventing significant adverse impacts. And also what we agreed back in 2012, that was in Rio, plus 20 about, you know, consistent with precautionary and ecosystem-based approach. So identifying priority areas, I would suggest needs to be done, on scientific principles, but also on principles of representativity, making sure that you're actually protecting coherent large-scale sites just to protect them, even if you don't know what the threats are. And it's going to take action on as many wheels as we have. Pew has identified, 10 potential areas, but we need to do much more than that. And then you also need to make sure that they are connected. So we're actually protecting the migratory species across their corridors. So it's a difficult task, which is why you need a scientific and technical advisory body to help guide many of these deliberations. And we hopefully have governments and scientists coming together now to really start thinking about where do we go first, what sort of management, what sort of research do you need to get these places functionally operational. Thanks.
Thanks, Christina.
Can I add one more thing, Ambassador?
Go ahead.
Felsen? And so I just wanted to add again that, vulnerability is not just the ecological things, it's not just how at risk they are of being impacted, but there's another, beyond the scientific perspective, there's another perspective that needs to be brought in, and that is of the cultural perspective. So, what is the cultural importance of these areas? And that will require, a huge consultation with a variety of stakeholders to be able to answer that question.
Thanks, Dr. Mann, for raising that. Indeed, it's something that has been reinforced by many small island developing states in the discussions in the BBNJ treaty when we're talking about the processes for ABMTs and even for EIAs and SEAs. Nicola, why don't you give us a little bit more of a perspective on what's happening within BBNJ, discussing these different types of standards, where we're at, and maybe where we should be going.
Absolutely, and maybe I'll just start out by echoing everything that Dr. Ramon and Christina shared as well. When we did our sort of Pew, when we tried to come up with our Pew algorithm for prioritizing, areas of the high seas to protect, there were only 15 of us, and it took, like 4 full-day workshops or in order to land on sort of which criteria and methodology we would use. And that's only 15 people who are sort of like-minded scientists. So, applying that on a grand scale is going to be a very real challenge. And just all of you could get into the detailed mechanisms of how you could adjust we set the dial at 30%. But, Diva mentioned earlier that there are some habitats where you would want to protect more than 30%, right? You might want to protect 100% of deep sea vents, for example, or other areas where you have high levels of endemic species. So anyway, I'll just, when they were talking, I was like, yes, all of those things are such real challenges that I would absolutely echo. But yeah, and bringing it into and also considering connectivity, as Christina mentioned, I would say is another really important factor. Another challenge to consider. Bringing it to sort of the BBNJ context, there's a question of there's currently a draft list of criteria to be under consideration. There's a question of whether we need criteria at all, or not, because if you take a look at the list of criteria, there's a lot of overlap between what's found, and I'm like, this is my copy of the text, by the way. There's a lot of overlap between what's found in that annex of sort of draft criteria and what's found in criteria in other ocean governance organizations, right? The EPSA criteria, for example, for identifying ecologically and biologically significant areas, another process under the CVD. But to Christina's point about polycentricity, there's a question about, is it actually helpful? It can be helpful to have some duplication, right? So it may not necessarily be harmful to have some of those same criteria under multiple processes. Some might argue that's actually a helpful and reinforcing thing to have. But I think a key question is making sure that those aren't, that they're indicative criteria, that they're not exhaustive, and making sure that we frame it in such a way that an area isn't expected to meet all of those criteria, right, to be considered or identified. You might have an area that is exceptional in one of the criteria, and that alone should be sufficient for identification. Another challenge, I think, within the context of, or I shouldn't say challenge, well, a challenge, and then a topic of conversation within the BBNJ discussions. Christina mentioned making sure we have a robust scientific and technical body, but also the type of knowledge that's going to be able to be considered for this, right? There's, of course, traditional scientific knowledge, but then there's a big and ongoing debate that, of course, Ambassador Filson, you are more familiar with than most people in the world, I think, which is the inclusion of traditional knowledge within sort of that discussion about the scientific body and its analysis and its identification of important areas. So I would sort of raise that as well as, and that builds off of, I think, Diva's point about linking to sort of some of these areas of cultural importance. And, I think we can realize and appreciate some other potential lessons from EBSAs, for example, we talked about how prioritizing is a real challenge. You might have different priorities in different regions, right? And EBSA does that under the CBD by having sort of different regional workshops where they identify whatever is a priority for the region. Do you see something replicated like that for BBNJ? Maybe yes, maybe no. Maybe you started with EBSAs as a potential starting point. A lot of ideas, but I've talked way too much, and I want to make sure that we hear from Gwen as well.
Yes, definitely. Thanks, Nicola. Those are very important points you raised. Gwen, why don't you take us through some of the national considerations when addressing vulnerable areas with, incomplete or uncertainty?
I think for the national level, the interest, just from Palau's perspective, I mean, we really don't know what is in our seabed, so to speak, especially in our deep waters. But our interest is in protecting the areas where the tuna fisheries, especially now that we're looking at pelagics and use. So in the high seas, for us, it's the connectivity of where these tuna fisheries travel. And that would be where our interest in protecting those high sea pockets, because then that will affect our natural resources or our access to natural resources within our national jurisdictions. So I think it's good to have these criteria, but at the same time, but when it comes to the national level, it's going to be what are the national priorities for protecting these high seas? And for us, it's the fisheries, the tuna fisheries at this time.
Thank you very much, Gwen. I will move on to the second question. Again, this is drawn from the questions that were put in the Q&A. So Dr. Eman and Professor Roberts both mentioned the need for MPAs to span the seafloor to the surface, next way around. Can this be achieved in the high seas if governance of the seabed remains under a different agreement and the body, so the ISA, then governance of the water column might fall under? So this idea of the coordination or lack of coordination between ISA and potentially those bodies that will be determined as BBNJ bodies. Christina, would you like to start us off on that?
Sure. That was, you could answer this yourself, I would think. The International Seabed Authority is, yes, responsible for ensuring effective protection of the marine environment from the harmful effects of seabed mining. The marine environment, as Alina Jekyll, who's listening here, helped to enlighten us all, does not just include the deep sea floor, it also includes the water column above. And similarly, that was when you're dealing with areas beyond national jurisdiction. The International Seabed Authority, if has responsibility only for one tiny activity on the seafloor, at least right now. And certainly deep seabed mining is controversial. It has not started yet, but there are other activities going on the seafloor. We know everything from deep sea bottom fishing to cable laying to marine scientific research. There are other activities going on now. Without a consistent and vertically integrated approach, you're not going to be able to protect the whole ecosystem. The scientists who study the mesopelagic realm, the stuff that's below the sunlit surface and then and above the deep sea, say deep seabed mining could have tremendous impacts on habitat, on water quality, on food security, because the particles could infiltrate into the water. So there needs to be a way for the shared responsibility to be activated. That was so the global community can say that we want these areas to be protected, and let's find a way to work together to make sure that these areas are in fact protected. I mean, a frustrating thing for me was that the Convention on Biological Diversity had recognized Mid-Atlantic Ridge, including the Lost City, as an area of ecological or biological significance. But the International Seabed Authority went ahead and allocated the area for exploration, with the view that this may become potential area for exploitation. There was no consultation with the outside scientific community who's been studying this area for 20, 30 years, with the conservation community, or even with the Convention on Biological Diversity. So it's this taking of unilateral decisions that affect international community interest is something that I'm hoping the BBNJ agreement can start to shed light on. And again, highlighting this need for the joined up obligation indeed to protect and preserve the marine environment, including rare and fragile ecosystems, represented ecosystems. And that was my one point about the BBNJ agreement. What it's still missing, even though it's implicit in law of the Sea Convention, is that clear-cut obligation to cooperate to establish marine protected areas and a network of MPAs. There's an obligation to conduct environmental impact assessments, but there's not that counterpart obligation that says, yes, we are going to work together and ensure our decisions are aiming towards positive outcomes and not just endless cooperation. I'll leave it there and turn it over to Nicola.
Yes, exactly. Nicola, I'd like you to pick up on that that last point. And of course, you've already mentioned the issues of the institutional frameworks. There's also that tricky issue in the BBNJ agreement that talks about cooperation or not undermining principle. So could you enlighten us?
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you so much. And thank you to Christina for that fabulous, fabulous answer to build off of. So of course, as Ambassador Felsen just alluded to, there's an obligation for the BBNJ agreement to not undermine existing bodies and management organizations that are working in the high seas. But of course, this phrase "not undermine" is incredibly ambiguous, and it has a variety of interpretations, with some viewing not undermining as meaning, oh, well, that means that the BBNJ agreement can't touch fish or the area or anything else because there are other organizations that work in this area, right? But that's a really restrictive way of viewing it, and it's not consistent with how we find this phrase in the fish stocks agreement, which is within the context of not undermining the effectiveness of, right? So not making these organizations and institutions less effective, I think is a sort of a more empowering way to interpret this phrase of not undermine. And really, I think one of the key solutions to this, how we get sort of comprehensive MPAs that can protect across the ecosystem from the seafloor to the sea surface, complementary measures is going to be a key tool in our toolbox to achieve that. And the idea behind this is a little bit convoluted and complex, but I'll try and quickly just go over it, which is that, let's say you have the BBNJ agreement, parties to the BB, and I should say central to their effectiveness is states parties, because of course you have the same countries that are going to be states parties to the BBNJ agreement that are going to be parties to these other relevant agreements like the ISA, like regional fisheries management organizations, for example. So the idea behind complementary measures is that you have a BBNJ agreement that says, okay, party, like, let's say, country A, as a member of the BBNJ agreement, we've established this MPA in this area. That means you, in your national capacity, are agreeing to not fish there. You might be agreed to not pursue any mining claims as your own national capacity in that area. And then, other protections from other sectors. Then that country would be, obliged to pursue complementary measures that would complement that work in those other bodies. So it would be obliged to, within the regional fisheries management organization that it's also a member to, pursue some sort of fisheries protection, right? That could actually sort of fill in gaps where the BBNJ can't work, right? Because it is already managed by another organization. It similarly could be obliged to pursue within the ISA, an area of particular environmental interest, an APEI that would protect that particular area from the impacts of seabed mining. It's a little more complicated than that because, of course, all of these processes are very complicated and have their own time-consuming processes for identifying these areas. But that's, I think, one of the powerful tools that we can hope to see realized in the BBNJ agreement.
Great, thanks, Nicola. I have two other questions, but did either Diva or Gwen, would you like to weigh in on that previous question? I'll move on to the other. And this relates to the science policy interface. So in other bodies relevant to biodiversity governance, one could argue that political decisions have lagged the science, if not decisions have been somewhat insufficient compared to what the best available science says is needed. What makes the panelists optimistic or cautious about ensuring science guides decisions regarding high seas biodiversity? And maybe I will start off with Dr. Eman on that question.
Okay, can you repeat the question one more time, just so I make sure I'm clear on what is being asked?
Yeah, no problem. So what would make you optimistic or cautious about ensuring that science guides decisions regarding high seas biodiversity? I guess what would you expect from the BBNJ treaty in terms of an institutional framework that would facilitate that closer interface of science with the policy or decision makers?
So I'll go back. So I think I'll start off by saying, in terms of being optimistic, I'd say that we know more than we ever have about our ocean and our high seas in particular. Yes, data is still deficient, but technology is growing leaps and bounds, and the need for science to be more inclusive and equitable is also being recognized. And so I do truly think that we are on the right path to more science being gathered in a way that is responsible and equitable and really will benefit more people. I also see that there's science is sort of slowly, and I'm saying this from a scientific perspective, but science is slowly waking up to the fact that science, of course, we need baseline data, but science also needs to be framed, especially as we have limited resources, around answering questions that really contribute to improving the needs or improving the lives, I should say, of ocean-dependent people. And I think that is increasingly being recognized by the scientific community as well. And the last thing I'll say that makes me optimistic is that, more than ever, scientists are engaging with policymakers and trying to translate their science as best as possible so that it is used by a variety of stakeholders. And I think now more than ever, also policymakers are more receptive to scientists. So we really are having that two-way exchange that does need to happen in order for effective management really to take place on the high seas. What makes me cautious, and then I'll hand it over to the others, is actually what was tackled in those questions earlier. I did have concerns about the silos that still remain and how that would essentially, those would be tackled to lead to holistic management. And that's it.
Thanks, Gwen. I'm going to pass the floor over to you, and you can speak to how you're seeing integration of science with policy decision-making in your national perspective, but also to the extent that you've seen that in the CBD context where you're also negotiating. You're still on mute.
Sorry, I keep forgetting about that. But I think I'm echoing what Diva had just said previously, that we're starting to see at the national level, we're starting to see that there are now more interactions with between science and policymakers, and that some of our policies now are relying on science to first tell them whether or not they can open a season of a particular species that was closed through legislation, and allowing scientists to determine that and say, yes, there is enough, no, there isn't enough, before they decide that they open it. So we're seeing that a lot in our country now, and that and the new administration here has always been about, again, about data. Does the data support what you're saying, that what you're saying is true? So I think nationally we are getting better at that. So I am hopeful. In the CBD context, especially in the SUBSTA, which is the subsidiary body for technology and technological advice, we're seeing that a lot of countries are using science as a basis for why they're arguing, especially now with the development of the global biodiversity framework, is that a lot of countries are now not accepting just because you said it as a country, but what was the science, or what support do you have to say that the statement you're making is necessary to put that in the GBF for all the other countries to follow. So I think science is becoming very critical as part of our negotiations for CBD. Thank you.
Thank you, Gwen. Christina, please go ahead.
Sure. I'm quite taken with the Second World Ocean Assessment, and particularly the preface by the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, where he is saying that, really to ensure sustainability, we must work together to improve integrated ocean management. And the way to achieve that is through joint research, capacity development, and the sharing of data, information, and technology. And until we really set up those platforms that enable both the research, the capacity development, and the sharing of data, information, and technology by all the sectors, are we going to be able to achieve integrated ocean management? And at this point, we really don't have any choice unless we want to see many of these ecosystems fail, many of our species start to disappear. This is not a pretty picture that I'm hearing from Antarctica, where it's warmer than it's ever been, where Norway is basking in heat, where Canada is frying. We really need to start thinking about how our choices today are going to affect our future tomorrow. And if it's not on science, what else do we trust?
Thank you very much, Christina. And of course, you have the UN Decade of Ocean Science, which is intended to sort of bring all of these together. But we're dealing with a very short time scale for us to take action. And the BBNJ agreement is already too late in being concluded. We need to see it concluded faster and sooner, and hopefully in 2022. Now that we've had to delay negotiations yet again because of COVID-19. I know we're running very short on time at 3 minutes. There are some other questions regarding cumulative impacts, as Diva Aman had already mentioned. And one of the questions is, how can area-based management tools under the BBNJ agreement remain adaptive to a change in ocean where specific species and our entire ecosystems are changing their location over the long term? Any takers on that particular question? And Nicola, if you wanted to start off. So how can the ABMTs remain adaptive to a change in ocean, especially given the scale?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great question. And I think having regular review of those area-based management tools is going to be absolutely critical to that. Not to the extent of, oh, we're going to completely get rid of this MPA, but I think we're going to regularly check in on the MPA to ensure that it's still placed appropriately to meet the stated objectives, and to assess how it's doing at meeting those conservation and sustainable use objectives that it's set out to try and achieve. And having that review process such that it can be adaptable, right? So that you can have parties meet regularly to determine if adjustments need to be made, so that it can be a tool that's better tailored to the changing environment that we have. I'm also going to say, I hope Christina makes a mention to, there's this idea about having sort of MPAs that are mobile and dynamic MPAs, and I think it's such a fascinating scientific concept to have adaptive and mobile MPAs, but I think the key really is to ensure that you have language in the BBNJ agreement that's flexible, so that you could have you could create future tools, not just static MPAs as we know them today, but you create a future-proof treaty that would empower, the possible creation of a future tool that is more responsive to these changing ocean environments. But I think it's Christina. I think you've been a little bit more involved in that work than me, so I might leave it to you to speak more on those.
So I have 30 seconds and then we'll wrap up because I think I'll be cut off. Essentially 30 seconds to Christina, Diva, and Gwen. Last thoughts, Christina, you could give on what Nicola just referred to, and then last thoughts from Diva and Gwen.
Okay, we need global assistance with monitoring, control, surveillance by sharing that data, as well as the data on where the species are and the productivity and the ecosystem. We can start to design dynamic tools to track the species, track the ecosystem. It's not going to replace marine protected areas, but we need more creativity around the measures that are actually in place. And thank you.
Diva?
Nothing to add on that question, but just to leave everyone with, biodiversity on the high seas is absolutely integral to maintaining the ecological integrity of those ecosystems and trying to maintain the resilience of the ocean in terms of the climate mitigation and adaptation. So really, this BBNJ treaty is potentially our pathway there, and the more robust a treaty, the better.
Last but not least, Gwen, what do you see
Thank
from
you.
Palau?
So just to quickly answer that question from Palau's perspective is that fishermen are starting to see that the fish that used to be where they used to fish is no longer there, and that the places are shifting. So that is making us also, with the Protected Areas Network, assess whether or not the biodiversity nursery area is still where it is, or does that need to shift, and working with the resource owners to consider shifting or moving that location to cover where it is now. And then really just to sort of close off, it is really good to do work nationally, but we are seeing that we need to also expand that work outside to our neighboring countries and globally so that we can still sustain all the work that we're doing nationally. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gwen, and thank you to all the panelists and the audience for joining us on this very important discussion on how we can improve ocean resilience and ocean biodiversity through a new high seas treaty, the BBNJ. Thank you all. It was a pleasure. It was a great conversation, and I think there are a lot of threads there to pick up on, and certainly a lot for policymakers to start working on. Thank you again, and thank you to the organizers of the Global Dialogue. Goodbye.